Hello, and thanks for joining me. We are talking about 8 tips for being financially prepared for a disaster. And I want to just start out before we get into the tips here. I'm not recommending anything. We'll probably be using the names of some products. We're talking about different types of insurances and things like that. This is not a recommendation or an endorsement for anything, and the prices are subject to change. Please check with a professional in your area if you are looking for any of these things so that you get what is perfect for you. Now, I wanted to put together this presentation about being financially prepared for a disaster, really because of a request that we got from a participant. We know that there have been a lot of disasters in the last year or so. And if you recall, here in the Midwest, we've had tornadoes all spring and summer, really tore up a number of areas. In fact, this is a river flooded and really just destroyed a bunch of homes, destroyed a bunch of personal properties, even in some areas that are generally not hit by flooding. Certainly can be hit by it at any point. And then, of course, California had a number of earthquakes, actually. And I was actually visiting Southern California when they got hit with one. And California is certainly not the only place that can be impacted by things like earthquakes. A number of disasters can hit you. And what I wanted to talk about were 8 specific quick tips that I think will be really helpful as you get yourself and your family prepared in case a disaster hits. So the first tip is have proper insurance. And I'm sure a lot of us will have homeowners insurance and kind of some of our health and life and disability insurances. But what I'm talking right now is property insurances. So flood insurance is a very popular one. If you live in a flood zone and you have a mortgage that is backed by a government agency, you may have to have flood insurance on your property. And if you do, you probably are aware that it can be quite expensive. Now, because you're not in a flood zone does not necessarily mean that you don't need flood insurance. If you're close to one, you absolutely might benefit from getting it. And it might be quite a bit cheaper than it is for the people that are actually in those flood zones. In fact, I saw a number that 20% of flood damage is outside of flood zones. So just because you're not in a flood zone right now, 1, doesn't mean you won't have home damage from a flood. And 2, it also doesn't mean that those flood zones won't change. So they're redrawing the maps regularly on those types of things. So it's really important to know what your risk is. And a lot of people think that homeowners insurance covers flood damage. In fact, it really does not. So rising water that engulfs your home is something that is usually not covered. The other one is earthquake insurance. You may not know that you can actually have it, especially if you don't live in an active area for earthquakes like the Pacific Rim. But you can absolutely get earthquake insurance. And they actually say that damage from earthquakes is one of the things that can really bankrupt families quickly, because if your home, maybe it's a couple $100,000, is not covered by your insurance and damaged by an earthquake, you may owe money on the home and then never be able to recover from it. So earthquake insurance will usually cover 85 to 90% of your home if you have damage from an earthquake, which can be substantial, but it certainly leaves you some exposure. But having $10, $15, or $20,000 of exposure could be a lot better than having $100,000, $150,000, or $200,000 of exposure or more. Earthquake insurance also can't be purchased right after earthquake. So there's a period of time between the last event and when you can even actually buy it. So it's not something that you can buy last minute. So for the people recently here in Southern California that experienced an earthquake, they can't even buy it until that period of time expires. Now, you don't have to be in California, and I don't mean to single them out. If you look at this map, you can see that there are lots of places, including Southern Illinois here. I think it's the New Madrid fault line is a very active fault line and can cause a lot of damage. And a lot of places that you haven't had any seismic activity for a while is not an indication that they won't. It can be an indication that you might be overdue. So as you're thinking about, hey, do I need flood coverage? Do I need earthquake coverage? And if you do, explore it, especially if you're not close to these central areas for earthquakes. The coverage for earthquake coverage is much, much cheaper. So it actually can be quite affordable. The second thing on our checklist here is store photos in the cloud. Now, this is going to be a much broader recommendation for a lot of us. Our family photos, those memories can be really important to store. And so you don't want to lose those, flood, fire, earthquake, whatever. But it's not just those personal photos that you want to store and have copies of, but it is photos of, say, things that you might need to replace. A lot of insurance agents have told people to go around, take photos of your home. What valuables do you have? What family heirlooms do you have? What are the condition of things? Take photos of those, store them in a safe place. But just taking photos of those and putting your drawer at home might not be a safe place if your house gets wiped out you're going to want digital copies of those. But the other things that you can take photos of are ID, passports, maybe legal documents, marriage certificates, titles of your car, whatever. Those types of things you might want to just have documentation of. It might help get replacements if you ever need to do that. It also might be handy if you actually have to prove your own identity. Google Drive is a free place where you can get some cloud storage, iCloud from Apple. There are a number of places that you can upload files. So if you can take those photos, upload them, you can use an app on your phone and have those so that you can recall those if you ever need to. It can be really convenient in a crisis situation. Number 3, have hard copies of things. Again, this is going to be a pretty broad recommendation, but if you think about how many phone numbers do you remember these days, right? So a lot of us just dial by voice or by the favorites in our phone. So many phone numbers we don't even remember, whether it's people close to us, let alone family or friends or even distant relatives. It's going to be almost impossible to remember some of those numbers. The recommendation here is to have all those phone numbers written down, maybe the addresses, ways to get in touch with people, important contacts, friends, family, but also contact information for like your utility companies, any accounts that you have open, financial accounts. How about legal contacts, attorneys, people that work with your family? How about the contact information for your health insurance companies or medical providers? And then also the insurance information, your health insurance cards, medical insurance cards, any prescriptions that you might be taking, to have physical copies of that, because if the power goes out, you might not be able to get online, or if the internet goes out, you might not be able to get online to get those things. And so you're going to want physical copies of that. But on top of that, the additional recommendation is to potentially laminate those things. So you can go to craft stores, go online, buy these peel and stick laminating sheets. So once you print out these things, put them between these plastic adhesive sheets, and now water or sunlight won't damage them as much. And so if you end up having flooding, you can still read these things. If you put them in your backpack and you're out in the rain, or being evacuated somewhere, you'll still be able to have all this material. You won't have to worry about it getting ruined by the elements. So hard copies, old school technology with laminate can be a lifesaver to have that information when you need it. And number 4, have some cash. And of course, depending on your financial state, you might say, hey, I don't want to have a lot of cash on hand. And I'm not saying that you should have a lot of cash, but having some cash on hand, if there's an emergency, can be really helpful. For example, if the power goes out, if there's a natural disaster, the reality is you are probably not going to be able to get to an ATM. You're not even going to see them powered on, let alone maybe there's a run on the cash that it would have. Just being able to make some deals on food or water or supplies if you need to is probably going to be done in cash. Now, one thing that you can do to help reduce your need for a lot of cash is have some of the supplies that you might need to spend that cash on. For instance, food and water are probably going to be the most important things if disaster hits. Things like this, like these Day-Trex snack bars, are just really high caloric food. You can store them on the shelf. They're shelf stable. And these can be a great way just to be able to have nutrition for a few days if you need it. Water is another big thing. I know that if they say that there's going to be a natural disaster and you're afraid of water mains breaking or water not being available, to actually just fill your bathtub. That's water that you could use and drink in an emergency. They actually sell a product like this called Water Bob, which is a giant plastic bag that you fill up in your bathtub so that it doesn't actually come in contact with the bathtub, so it keeps it drinkable. But a couple of those things, food and water, clothing and shelter, the essentials there, and that's often what money gets traded for in case of emergency. So if you can have some cash, great. If you can have the supplies so that you don't need as much cash, that's great too. Number 5, have a plan to regroup. This is going to be a fairly simple one, but it's something that gets really overlooked a lot of times. If you have a family or if you have friends or roommates or whatever it is, where will you go depending on the types of emergencies? And the reality is, in most cases, if it's a storm coming through, you'll probably hunker down at home. Going back to your residence is probably the first line of defense. But let's say the home is flooded or there's a fire or a natural disaster, or in Chicago a few years ago, a home exploded from a gas leak. And so the whole subdivision was uninhabitable for a while. You're probably going to need a second location. And maybe it's somewhere close, but maybe it's somewhere slightly far away, a family member or a relative. But maybe you need a third meeting location in case that location is inaccessible too. And maybe it's even out of state, right? Maybe the whole area is flooded or you're dealing with wildfires. And so the issue is you just want to put as much distance between you and the disaster as possible. So having a couple of different contingency plans and locations where you can go, I think, and knowing what the order are and sharing that with your family and friends so that you're all on the same page. So when something happens and people can't communicate, they'll have a plan. Number 6, contact your lenders. So if you're borrowing money, you have financial institution relationships, whether you have a car loan or home loan, contact them, let them know that you're in a disaster area. A lot of lenders will have protocols in place if you're calling in, especially in emergency disaster zones or federally declared disaster areas, often suspending payments. Really, the big one here is if you have an auto draw that automatically draws from your bank accounts to pay those bills. That's something that might be worth suspending or letting them know so that they suspend it automatically, because you may need that cash and they may give you some grace period while you're dealing with an emergency. Things like credit cards, let them know that you may be charging a lot of money on credit cards in a totally different area. So you don't want your credit card to get turned off. It can be maybe hard to get in touch with them, but also make sure that they understand that you're dealing with emergency and they might make some accommodation for you. And student loans too, it's one that we probably don't think about, but getting some accommodation there as well, especially while you're dealing with life in general, as opposed to trying to service your loans. Number 7, apply with FEMA. FEMA stands for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they're usually the agency that comes in to respond to disasters. They usually bring in everything from food, water, money to troops and manpower support. They will often have some trucks or some locations set up. The most common areas, you've got to understand that if there is an emergency, they might be on a delay when they get there. They can't come in during a hurricane. It's going to be afterwards. And so a lot of these things, while you might expect the government to be there very quickly, it doesn't necessarily mean they'll be there right away. And you might have a period of time, maybe days, that you have to take care of yourself and your family and fend for yourself. You certainly want to make contact with FEMA if they're going to be in your area supporting it as quickly as possible. Disasterassistance.gov is going to be a website that will have relevant information. For the flooding that happened here in the Midwest, there was lots of information on that. Even if your area is not considered a disaster zone, they may be able to provide you some help and relief. In fact, I heard that because cash was so hard to get in some areas, FEMA actually had cash so that you could make withdrawals with FEMA representatives at that time. And then number 8, and this one I think doesn't just apply to disasters, although I think a lot of people can count on people trying to capitalize on disasters, but just watch out for scams and, just be skeptical, be very diligent. Be careful about who you're giving out information or money to. If you get a call asking for you to verify your FEMA information or registration information and you haven't applied to FEMA yet, double check that. Make sure that's real. If you have people coming and representing a government agency, double check their credentials. If you have people coming and saying they're from insurance companies, adjusters, inspectors, they may be, but you want to double check that, get their information. Maybe contact your insurance agency or your insurance company to make sure that's all on the up and up. People asking for money, that is often a scam. In fact, if someone is representing the federal government, they will almost never ask you for money. They are there to provide assistance, not to take any form of payment. And even charities and organizations that are there on the ground to help you will probably never ask you for compensation. So just be aware of that. And then there are often fake offers of federal aid. You might get emails or calls, whatever, some sort of solicitation. Just be wary of anything like that. Check, double check, make sure that you are comfortable, that you are talking to the people that you think they are when you're making those arrangements. And then be very careful with your social security number. This is probably a threshold where if you get to it and people are asking for your social security number, there can be a number of reasons that they're doing that. If you're calling your financial institution, they may need that to verify your accounts, but I would not give it away to people that are requesting it. I would usually, if you can, call into the organization, call indirectly to their phone numbers if you need to provide them personal information. Don't just give it to anyone who is asking you for that information. There is a FEMA guide out there. It's actually on their website. It's called the FEMA Emergency Financial First Aid Kit. It's a nice little booklet. It's got a lot more tips on it. It's got some worksheets and some checklists that you can use. You can download this. It's available in a PDF at FEMA.gov or ready.gov. They give you some other information too on how to make an emergency kit, a food kit, a survival kit, those types of things as well. It's also in a physical copy if you have access to that, but you can just download it. And I will say that superseding all of this is if something happens, tornado, flash floods, whatever it might be, it's most important to take care of yourself, stay safe, address all of your immediate needs, and put your financial needs later, right? We can sort out the financials and sort out the money issues later, but it's really important to obviously protect life, not take any risk, get everyone out of harm's way.